The Montana wind cut through Sunset Valley like a blade forged from pure ice, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter that would test every rancher's resolve. Jake Harrison stood at the edge of his property line, watching dark clouds gather over the Rocky Mountain peaks that towered above his struggling operation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Silver Creek Ranch stretched out before him in rolling waves of brown grass and scattered cattle, a testament to 4 generations of Harrison family sweat and stubbornness. What had once been a thriving operation now felt more like a beautiful prison, trapping him between memories of better times and the harsh reality of modern ranching economics. The numbers didn't lie, though Jake wished they would. Feed costs had tripled in the past 2 years, thanks to drought conditions that had turned most of the surrounding grassland into something resembling a moonscape. Corporate agriculture giants were buying up neighboring properties at prices that would have seemed like fantasy money just a decade ago, leaving independent ranchers like Jake to compete for resources they could barely afford. His grandfather would have called it progress, though Jake suspected the old man would have had some choice words about corporations treating cattle like manufacturing widgets rather than living creatures that deserved respect and proper care. Behind him, the ranch house stood solid and weathered, its log construction a reminder of the days when Harrison men built things to last. The wraparound porch where his grandmother used to shell peas and watch summer storms roll across the valley now held empty rocking chairs that creaked in the wind like ghosts of conversations long past. 3 years of trying to run the operation single-handedly had taken its toll on both the property and Jake himself. At 32, he already felt the accumulated weight of sleepless nights spent checking on calving cows, emergency repairs to equipment that should have been replaced years ago, and the constant worry about whether the next bank statement would finally force him to accept defeat. The irony wasn't lost on him that his current predicament stemmed partly from his own stubbornness about maintaining what he called traditional ranching values. While other operations had embraced automation and efficiency measures that required minimal human oversight, Jake still believed that good cattle management meant actually knowing your animals individually, understanding their personalities and needs rather than treating them as mere inventory. This philosophy required more hands than he could afford to hire, especially when every neighboring ranch was competing for the same shrinking pool of experienced workers who understood that ranching wasn't just a job but a way of life that demanded complete dedication. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled Jake from his brooding. A dust-covered pickup truck was making its way up the long driveway that connected the ranch house to the county road, moving slowly enough to suggest that the driver was taking time to evaluate what they saw. Jake recognized the deliberate pace of someone with genuine interest rather than the hurried approach of salespeople or bill collectors who had become far too familiar visitors in recent months. As the truck drew closer, he could make out the logo of Patterson Employment Services painted on the door, which meant that his desperate plea for help might finally be getting a response. Patterson Employment had been his last resort after 3 months of fruitless attempts to find qualified ranch hands through traditional channels. The old network of word-of-mouth recommendations that had served his father and grandfather so well seemed to have dried up along with the regional economy. Experienced cowboys were either retiring, moving to more stable industries, or being lured away by the corporate operations that could offer better benefits and regular hours. Jake had swallowed his pride and contacted the employment agency 2 weeks ago, explaining that he needed someone who could handle everything from cattle management to equipment maintenance, preferably someone willing to work for wages that reflected his current financial reality rather than current market rates. The truck came to a stop near the main barn, and Jake walked over with the measured stride of a man who had learned not to get his hopes up too quickly. The driver who emerged was Stan Patterson himself, a grizzled man in his 60s who had been matching workers with employers throughout the region for nearly 30 years. Stan had the kind of weathered face that spoke of countless hours spent outdoors, evaluating both job sites and the people who might work them. His expression was typically unreadable, the professional mask of someone who had delivered both good news and crushing disappointments with equal frequency. What Jake hadn't expected was the passenger who stepped out of the truck's other side. Maria Santos moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable in work boots and worn jeans. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that wouldn't interfere with physical labor. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that immediately caught Jake's attention, though his first instinct was confusion rather than interest. Patterson Employment had a reputation for understanding their clients' needs, and Jake was certain he had been quite specific about the type of worker he required for the demanding physical challenges of ranch work. Stan Patterson approached with his usual directness, extending a handshake that carried the firmness of someone who valued honest communication. "Jake Harrison," he said by way of introduction, though they had met several times over the years when Jake's father had used the agency's services. "This is Maria Santos, and before you say anything, I want you to hear me out completely. She's got more ranching experience than half the cowboys I've placed in the past 5 years, and she's willing to work for the wages you specified, which frankly surprised me given her qualifications." Jake found himself studying Maria more carefully, noting details that contradicted his initial assumptions. Her hands showed the calluses and small scars that came from years of handling wire fencing and unpredictable livestock. Her boots were expensive but well worn, the kind that serious workers invested in because cheap footwear could mean injury or discomfort during long days of physical labor. Most telling were her eyes, which held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating animals and situations quickly, making decisions that could mean the difference between success and disaster in agricultural work. "I appreciate you bringing someone out," Jake said carefully, trying to balance politeness with the practical reality of his situation. "But I was pretty clear about needing someone who could handle the heavy lifting that comes with this kind of operation. We're talking about wrestling steers, hauling feed that weighs more than most people can lift, and working in conditions that would challenge experienced ranch hands. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I can't afford to hire someone who isn't physically capable of doing everything that needs to be done around here." Maria stepped forward before Patterson could respond, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of bilingual fluency rather than limited English skills. "Mr. Harrison," she said with the confidence of someone who had heard similar objections before, "I've been working ranches since I was 12 years old, starting on my uncle's operation down in Texas. I can rope, brand, vaccinate, assist with difficult births, operate most farm equipment, and I've helped build more miles of fence than I care to count. If you're worried about my physical capabilities, I'm happy to demonstrate rather than just talk about them." The directness of her response caught Jake off guard. He had expected either defensive anger or nervous attempts to oversell limited qualifications, not this matter-of-fact presentation of relevant experience. Stan Patterson was nodding approvingly, clearly having anticipated this exact conversation. Jake realized that his assumptions about gender and physical capability were being challenged by someone who obviously understood ranch work from practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "She's worked the last 3 years at the R outside of Billings," Patterson added, pulling a folder from his truck. "Owner there said she was the best hand he'd ever employed. Never missed a day, never complained about overtime during calving season. And the cattle responded to her better than they did to workers with twice her experience. Only reason she's looking for new employment is that the R just got bought out by one of those corporate agriculture companies that's bringing in their own management team." Jake accepted the folder and began reviewing the documentation Patterson had assembled. The references were impressive, detailed accounts from multiple employers who praised not only Maria's technical skills, but her reliability and problem-solving abilities. One letter specifically mentioned her success in training a particularly difficult group of young cattle that had been considered nearly unmanageable by previous handlers. Another described her role in saving a significant portion of a herd during an unexpected blizzard, working for 36 hours straight to ensure that animals had adequate shelter and food. The photographs included in the file showed Maria in various ranch settings, clearly comfortable whether she was on horseback working cattle or operating heavy machinery for hay production. Jake found himself impressed despite his lingering reservations about hiring a woman for work that had traditionally been performed by men. The evidence suggested that Maria Santos possessed exactly the combination of experience and dedication that his operation desperately needed. Though he couldn't shake his concern about whether she truly understood the physical demands of working a ranch that was perpetually understaffed and under-resourced. Stan Patterson seemed to sense Jake's internal struggle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Look," he said pragmatically, "I know this isn't what you were expecting, and I understand your concerns about the physical requirements. But I've been in this business long enough to know that heart and experience matter more than raw strength. When it comes to successful ranch work, Maria here has proven herself in situations that would challenge any worker, and she's available immediately, which I know is important given your current staffing situation." Jake looked across his property, taking in the visible signs of neglect that had accumulated during months of trying to handle everything himself. Fence sections that needed repair, equipment that required maintenance he hadn't had time to perform, and pastures that would benefit from more attentive management. The rational part of his mind acknowledged that continuing to operate without adequate help would eventually lead to the kind of crisis that could destroy everything his family had built over 4 generations. Maria Santos watched him evaluate his options, her expression patient but alert. She understood that this was a pivotal moment for both of them, that his decision would determine whether she had found the stable employment she needed, and whether he had found the solution to problems that were slowly overwhelming his ability to cope. The Montana wind continued to howl around them, carrying the scent of approaching snow and the promise of challenges that would require all the skill and determination that both of them possessed. "What would you expect for wages?" Jake asked finally, acknowledging that practical considerations might outweigh his traditional assumptions about ranch work. Maria named a figure that was significantly lower than what he had been prepared to pay, explaining that she valued stable employment and the opportunity to work with quality cattle more than maximum compensation. Her willingness to accept reduced wages in exchange for steady work demonstrated exactly the kind of practical flexibility that his operation required. "I'll give you a 2-week trial period," Jake said after a long moment of consideration. "Full wages, and if things work out, we'll discuss a permanent arrangement. But I need to be honest about what you're getting into here. This isn't a corporate operation with backup systems and plenty of resources. When equipment breaks, we fix it ourselves. When cattle get sick, we handle treatment regardless of the time of day. When weather threatens the herd, we work until the animals are safe, even if that means going without sleep for days at a time." Maria extended her hand for a firm handshake that sealed their agreement. "Mr. Harrison," she said with quiet confidence, "I wouldn't have it any other way. When can I start?" The answer to that question came sooner than either of them anticipated. As Stan Patterson prepared to leave, his radio crackled with an emergency weather bulletin. A sudden temperature drop was moving through the region faster than meteorologists had predicted, threatening to create dangerous conditions for livestock that hadn't yet been moved to winter shelter. Jake felt his stomach clench as he realized that his cattle were scattered across several distant pastures. vulnerable to a weather system that could potentially kill dozens of animals if they weren't gathered and protected within the next few hours. "Looks like you're starting right now," he told Maria, his voice tight with the stress of impending crisis. "We've got about 200 heads spread across 3 different sections, and we need to get them all back to the protected areas near the ranch buildings before this storm hits. It's going to require riding hard across some pretty rough terrain, and we'll be working against both darkness and dropping temperatures." Maria was already moving toward the barn where Jake kept his horses, her response immediate and decisive. "Which horse do you want me to take?" she asked, demonstrating the kind of quick adaptability that experienced ranch workers develop through years of dealing with unexpected emergencies. Jake pointed toward a sturdy quarter horse named Thunder, a reliable mount that he typically reserved for challenging work because of the animal's steady temperament and sure footing on difficult ground. As they saddled their horses with practiced efficiency, Jake found himself reassessing his new employee based on her confident handling of both equipment and livestock. Maria moved around the barn with the familiarity of someone who had performed these same tasks countless times, her movements economical and purposeful. Thunder accepted her immediately, responding to her touch and voice in ways that suggested natural horsemanship skills that couldn't be taught but had to be developed through years of patient interaction with animals. The ride to the first pasture took them across terrain that would have challenged inexperienced riders, rocky ground broken by streams and dotted with obstacles that required careful navigation. Maria kept pace easily, her seat in the saddle, reflecting the deep balance that came from a lifetime of horseback work. Jake began to relax slightly as he observed her natural ability to read both the landscape and her mount's responses, adjusting her approach to match changing conditions without requiring guidance or instruction. The cattle they encountered in the first section were already showing signs of weather stress, clustering together in whatever shelter they could find from the increasing wind. Jake and Maria worked together to gather the animals, using a combination of direct herding and strategic positioning that demonstrated Maria's understanding of bovine psychology. She seemed to know instinctively how to approach nervous cattle in ways that encouraged cooperation rather than panic. Her calm presence having a visible effect on animals that were already stressed by changing atmospheric conditions. As they drove the first group of cattle toward safety, Jake found himself impressed by Maria's ability to anticipate problems before they developed into serious issues. When several young steers attempted to break away from the main group, she positioned herself to block their escape route while simultaneously encouraging the rest of the herd to maintain forward movement. Her horse responded to subtle cues that suggested a partnership built on mutual trust and understanding, the kind of relationship that separated truly skilled riders from those who simply knew how to stay mounted. The second pasture presented greater challenges, with cattle scattered across a wider area and terrain that included steep slopes and dense brush that could hide animals from view. Working together, Jake and Maria developed an efficient pattern that allowed them to cover the maximum area in minimum time, each taking responsibility for specific sections while maintaining communication about the location and movement of various groups. Jake began to understand why Maria's previous employers had praised her ability to work independently while contributing to team efforts. By the time they reached the third and most distant section, the temperature had dropped noticeably, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. The cattle in this area were the most scattered and the most difficult to gather, including several animals that had found sheltered spots and were reluctant to leave them. Maria demonstrated remarkable patience and skill in coaxing these stubborn individuals out of their hiding places, using a combination of gentle pressure and strategic positioning that eventually convinced even the most reluctant animals to join the moving herd. The return journey to the ranch buildings became a race against rapidly deteriorating conditions. Snow was falling more heavily now, and the wind had increased to the point where visibility was becoming limited. Jake felt the familiar stress of emergency livestock management, the knowledge that animal lives depended on making correct decisions under pressure. What surprised him was how much easier the challenge felt with Maria working alongside him, her presence providing both practical assistance and the psychological comfort of shared responsibility. As they drove the last group of cattle into the protected areas near the barn, Jake realized that Maria Santos had just proven herself more thoroughly than any formal evaluation could have accomplished. She had demonstrated not only the technical skills necessary for ranch work, but the kind of calm competence under pressure that separated good workers from exceptional ones. Her performance during this unexpected emergency had answered his questions about physical capability and work ethic more definitively than any interview or reference check could have managed. The storm that followed lasted 3 days, bringing the kind of early winter weather that could devastate unprepared livestock operations. Jake spent much of that time watching the weather reports and checking on his cattle, grateful that all of his animals were safely sheltered thanks to the emergency gathering operation that Maria had helped execute. As he observed the intensity of the storm, he began to appreciate how different the situation might have been if he had been working alone, trying to gather 200 head of cattle across difficult terrain without adequate assistance. When the weather finally cleared, Jake found Maria in the barn, performing routine maintenance on equipment that had been exposed to the storm conditions. She worked methodically, checking for damage and making minor repairs with the kind of attention to detail that prevented small problems from becoming major expenses. Jake realized that she had taken initiative to address issues without being asked, demonstrating the kind of self-direction that was essential for successful ranch operations, but couldn't be taught or mandated. Over the following days, Jake watched Maria integrate herself into the daily routines of ranch life with impressive ease. She seemed to understand intuitively which tasks required immediate attention and which could be postponed, managing her time efficiently while maintaining high standards for both animal care and equipment maintenance. Her presence allowed Jake to focus on longer-term planning and business development issues that he had been forced to neglect while handling every operational detail himself. What impressed him most was Maria's ability to communicate with the cattle in ways that made routine tasks significantly easier to accomplish. Animals that had been difficult to handle became cooperative when she worked with them, responding to her calm presence and consistent approach. Jake began to understand that her skills went beyond mere technical competence to include the kind of natural affinity with livestock that couldn't be learned but had to be developed through years of patient interaction and genuine respect for animal welfare. The 2-week trial period passed quickly, filled with the kind of collaborative work that demonstrated how much more efficient and effective ranch operations could be when handled by a properly functioning team. Jake found himself looking forward to each day's challenges, knowing that Maria's presence meant that problems could be solved rather than simply endured. Her combination of technical skills, practical wisdom, and steady reliability had transformed his struggling operation into something that felt sustainable and hopeful rather than merely desperate. As the trial period drew to a close, Jake realized that he faced a decision that would shape the future of the Silver Creek Ranch. Maria Santos had proven herself to be exactly the kind of worker his operation needed, someone who understood that successful ranching required dedication, flexibility, and genuine care for animal welfare. The question now was whether he could afford to keep her, and whether he could afford not to keep someone who had already demonstrated such exceptional value to his struggling business. The morning after the storm brought crystalline air and the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a postcard. Jake stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug warming his hands as he watched Maria move through the morning routine of checking on the cattle with the methodical precision of someone who understood that consistency in animal care meant the difference between healthy livestock and expensive veterinary bills. She had been at the ranch for exactly 2 weeks now, and Jake was finding it increasingly difficult to imagine managing the operation without her steady presence and practical expertise. What struck him most about Maria's approach to ranch work was her ability to anticipate problems before they became crises. Yesterday, she had noticed that one of the older cows was showing subtle signs of respiratory distress, catching an issue that could have developed into pneumonia if left untreated. Her observation skills extended beyond animal health to include equipment maintenance, pasture conditions, and weather patterns that affected everything from feeding schedules to breeding decisions. Jake had begun to rely on her insights in ways that surprised him, finding that her perspective often revealed solutions to problems he hadn't even recognized. The financial reality of his situation remained as challenging as ever, but Maria's presence had created operational efficiencies that translated directly into cost savings. Tasks that had previously required hiring temporary help could now be handled by their 2-person team, and the improved animal management was already showing results in terms of overall herd health and productivity. Jake found himself cautiously optimistic about the future for the first time in months, though he was careful not to let hope overshadow the practical considerations that still dominated his daily decision-making. The sound of a vehicle approaching the ranch house interrupted his morning contemplation. Jake recognized the expensive sedan that belonged to Robert Caldwell, owner of the largest ranch in the county and a man who had made no secret of his interest in acquiring the Silver Creek Ranch for incorporation into his corporate agriculture empire. Caldwell's visits were never social calls, and Jake felt his stomach tighten as he prepared for whatever proposition or ultimatum his wealthy neighbor had brought this time. Bobby Caldwell emerged from his vehicle with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of financial pressure and political connections. At 55, he had transformed his inherited family ranch into a regional powerhouse that operated more like an industrial facility than a traditional livestock operation. His success was undeniable, but it had come at the cost of the personal relationships and community connections that Jake considered essential to meaningful ranch life. Caldwell viewed cattle as profit-generating units and land as investment opportunities, an approach that had made him wealthy, but had also earned him a reputation for ruthless business practices. "Jake," Caldwell called out as he approached the porch, his tone carrying the forced friendliness of someone preparing to deliver an ultimatum. "I hope you've had time to consider our previous conversations about the future of this place. I know you've been struggling to keep things together, and I'm prepared to make an offer that would allow you to walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else, maybe try a different line of work that's more suited to current economic realities." The condescending nature of Caldwell's suggestion rankled Jake, but he kept his response measured and professional. "This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations, Bobby, and it's not for sale at any price. I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident that we can work through our current challenges and continue operating as an independent family ranch. I know that's an old-fashioned concept in today's agricultural economy, but some things are worth preserving even when they're not the most profitable option." Caldwell's expression hardened slightly, the friendly mask slipping to reveal the calculating businessman beneath. "Jake, you're being unrealistic about the situation here. Small operations like yours can't compete with modern efficiency standards, and pretending otherwise is just going to make the inevitable failure more painful for everyone involved. I'm offering you a way out that preserves your dignity and gives you financial resources to pursue other opportunities. If you wait until the bank forecloses, you'll walk away with nothing but debt and regret." The conversation was interrupted by Maria's approach from the barn area, where she had been completing her morning inspection of the cattle. She moved with the quiet confidence that Jake had come to appreciate, her presence somehow managing to change the dynamic of the confrontation. Without her saying a word, Caldwell's attention shifted to her with the kind of calculating assessment that made Jake immediately uncomfortable. Recognizing the predatory evaluation of someone who viewed other people primarily in terms of how they might be useful to his own interests. And who might this be? Caldwell asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I don't believe we've been introduced. Jake felt protective instincts rise as he recognized the tone of someone who was already formulating plans that probably didn't have Maria's best interests at heart. This is Maria Santos, my ranch manager, he said, choosing the title deliberately to emphasize her professional status and authority. She's been instrumental in improving our operational efficiency, and her expertise has already proven invaluable to our long-term planning. Caldwell extended his hand to Maria with exaggerated courtesy, though Jake could see the wheels turning behind his calculating eyes. Miss Santos, it's a pleasure to meet you. I have to say, it's unusual to see a woman in ranch management, especially on an operation like this one. I imagine you must have quite an interesting background to have convinced Jake here to trust you with such responsibilities. The subtle condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and Jake felt his jaw clench at the implied suggestion that Maria's qualifications were somehow suspect because of her gender. Maria accepted the handshake with polite firmness, her response revealing nothing of whatever thoughts she might have about Caldwell's patronizing approach. I've been working ranches most of my life, Mr. Caldwell, and I've found that cattle don't particularly care about the gender of the person taking care of them. They respond to competence, consistency, and genuine concern for their welfare, qualities that aren't limited to any particular demographic group. Jake felt a surge of admiration for the way she had deflected Caldwell's condescension while asserting her professional credentials. Caldwell's smile became more predatory as he shifted tactics, apparently recognizing that direct confrontation wasn't going to achieve his objectives. Well, I certainly admire your confidence. Ms. Santos, I wonder if you've given much thought to your long-term career prospects, working for an operation that's struggling to remain viable in today's competitive environment. Someone with your apparent skills might find much better opportunities with a more established organization, one that could offer proper compensation and advancement potential. The job offer, if it could be called that, was clearly intended to undermine Jake's ability to retain Maria's services while simultaneously demonstrating Caldwell's superior resources and market position. Jake felt anger building at the transparent attempt to poach his most valuable employee, but he forced himself to remain calm and let Maria respond in her own way. Her answer revealed both loyalty and practical wisdom that impressed him more than any dramatic declaration of allegiance could have managed. I appreciate the suggestion, Mr. Caldwell, but I'm quite satisfied with my current position. Mr. Harrison and I share similar philosophies about animal welfare and sustainable ranching practices, and I find that working for someone whose values align with my own is more important than maximizing short-term financial compensation. Jake felt warmth spread through his chest at her words, recognizing that she had not only rejected Caldwell's overture, but had done so in a way that reinforced their partnership and shared commitment to ethical ranching practices. Caldwell's expression revealed his frustration at having his recruitment attempt rebuffed so decisively. He wasn't accustomed to having his offers declined, especially by people whose current situations were less financially secure than what he could provide. Jake watched as his neighbor recalibrated his approach, apparently deciding that direct confrontation might be more effective than subtle manipulation. The change in tactics was almost visible, like watching someone switch from diplomatic negotiation to open hostility. Well, that's certainly your choice to make, Caldwell said, his tone hardening noticeably. But I think you should both understand the broader economic realities affecting this region. Small ranches like this one are becoming increasingly unsustainable, and the market forces driving consolidation aren't going to disappear just because people prefer traditional approaches. Jake, you're fighting a battle that you simply can't win, and involving other people in your inevitable failure seems unfair to everyone concerned. The threat implicit in Caldwell's words was unmistakable, though carefully phrased to maintain a veneer of concern rather than open intimidation. Jake recognized the tactics of someone who was accustomed to using economic pressure and political connections to achieve objectives that couldn't be accomplished through legitimate competition. The realization that Caldwell viewed the Silver Creek Ranch as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a competitor to be respected added a new dimension of urgency to Jake's struggle to maintain his family's legacy. "I think this conversation has gone far enough," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone defending his own property and values. "My ranch isn't for sale, my employees aren't available for recruitment, and your predictions about market forces don't change my commitment to maintaining an independent operation. I'd appreciate it if you'd respect those decisions and focus on managing your own business rather than trying to dictate how others should handle theirs." Caldwell's facade of friendly concern finally dropped completely, revealing the cold calculation that had driven his success in corporate agriculture. "Jake, you're making a mistake that's going to cost you everything you've inherited from your family. When this place finally fails, and it will fail, don't expect any sympathy or assistance from the community. People around here understand practical reality, and they're not going to waste time or resources supporting someone who's too stubborn to accept inevitable change." The explicit threat contained in Caldwell's parting words hung in the air long after his expensive sedan had disappeared down the ranch road. Jake felt the weight of isolation that came from knowing that his most powerful neighbor viewed him as an enemy rather than a fellow rancher facing similar challenges. The implications extended beyond simple business competition to include potential interference with suppliers, customers, and even community relationships that were essential to successful ranch operations. Maria watched the dust settle from Caldwell's departure before speaking, her voice carrying thoughtful concern rather than alarm. "He's not going to give up easily, is he?" The question revealed her understanding that the confrontation represented more than a simple business disagreement. That Caldwell's interest in acquiring the Silver Creek Ranch was part of a larger strategy that wouldn't be deterred by polite refusals or appeals to traditional values. Jake shook his head grimly, recognizing that Maria deserved honest information about the challenges they were likely to face in the coming months. Bobby Caldwell isn't accustomed to being told no, and he has the resources and connections to make life very difficult for people who don't cooperate with his plans. He's probably already thinking about ways to create pressure that will force me to sell whether I want to or not. The admission felt like acknowledging weakness, but Jake understood that effective partnership required honest communication about risks and challenges. The remainder of the morning was spent in routine ranch work, but Jake found his concentration affected by awareness of the larger forces arrayed against their efforts to maintain independence. Every task now carried additional weight, knowing that their success or failure would be scrutinized by someone actively hoping for their collapse. The cattle needed to be healthier, the equipment needed to function more reliably, and the financial management needed to be more precise than ever before, because any sign of weakness would be exploited by an adversary with superior resources and fewer ethical constraints. Maria's response to the increased pressure was characteristically practical and determined, rather than expressing concern about potential retaliation or economic interference. She focused on identifying areas where improved efficiency could strengthen their competitive position. Her suggestions for pasture rotation, feed optimization, and preventive health care demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond mere operational competence to include understanding of how individual decisions affected overall ranch viability. As they worked together throughout the day, Jake found himself increasingly grateful for Maria's presence and partnership. Her combination of technical expertise and strategic insight provided exactly the kind of support that his operation needed to navigate current challenges while building foundation for long-term success. More importantly, her commitment to their shared values gave him confidence that they could face whatever pressure Caldwell might apply without compromising the principles that made their work meaningful. The afternoon brought a visit from Father Miguel Rodriguez, the priest who served the Catholic Church that had become a community center for the region's Hispanic population. Father Miguel was a man in his 60s whose gentle demeanor concealed deep wisdom about human nature and community dynamics, gained through decades of counseling people facing various crises. His visits to the ranch were always welcome, both for their practical value and for the spiritual perspective he brought to challenging situations. "Jake and Maria," the priest said as he approached the porch where they were taking a brief rest from afternoon chores, "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit, but I wanted to check on how things were going and perhaps offer any assistance that might be helpful. I've been hearing rumors around town about increased tension between neighboring ranches, and I know from experience that such conflicts can affect entire communities if they're not addressed thoughtfully." Jake appreciated Father Miguel's diplomatic approach to what was obviously a more complex situation than casual community concern. The priest's network of relationships throughout the region meant that he often had access to information and perspectives that weren't available through conventional channels, and his involvement suggested that the confrontation with Caldwell had already become a topic of broader community discussion. "We had a visit from Bobby Caldwell this morning," Jake explained, choosing honesty as the most productive approach to addressing Father Miguel's concerns. "He made it pretty clear that he's not going to accept my refusal to sell the ranch, and he seemed to think that creating pressure through community isolation might change my mind about maintaining an independent operation. I'm concerned about what that might mean for our relationships with suppliers, customers, and neighbors who might feel forced to choose sides in a conflict they didn't create." Father Miguel nodded thoughtfully, his expression revealing familiarity with the kinds of pressure tactics that powerful individuals sometimes use to achieve objectives that couldn't be accomplished through legitimate means. "Bobby Caldwell has many admirable qualities, but patience and acceptance of opposition aren't among them. He's accustomed to getting his way through a combination of financial incentives and subtle coercion, and he tends to view resistance as a personal challenge rather than simply a business disagreement." The priest's assessment confirmed Jake's concerns about facing an adversary who had both the resources and the inclination to make their situation increasingly difficult. However, Father Miguel's next words offered a perspective that Jake hadn't considered, one that suggested potential allies and support systems that might counterbalance Caldwell's advantages in terms of wealth and political connections. "What you may not realize," Father Miguel continued, "is that many people in this community are concerned about the trend toward corporate consolidation in agriculture. They understand that independent family ranches like yours represent something valuable that's being lost as larger operations absorb smaller ones. There's more support for what you're trying to accomplish than you might imagine, though people are often reluctant to express their opinions publicly when they fear economic retaliation." Maria's presence during this conversation seemed to add weight to Father Miguel's observations about community support. Her integration into the local Hispanic community had created connections that extended beyond simple employment relationships to include cultural and social bonds that transcended individual business interests. Jake began to understand that their partnership represented more than just effective ranch management, that it symbolized possibilities for cooperation and mutual respect that had broader implications for community harmony. The priest's visit concluded with an offer of assistance that was both practical and spiritual in nature. Father Miguel explained that the church community included people with various skills and resources who might be able to provide support during challenging times, whether in the form of temporary labor, equipment loans, or simply moral encouragement when facing pressure from more powerful adversaries. The offer represented the kind of community solidarity that had historically enabled small operations to survive in the face of larger economic forces. As evening approached, Jake and Maria completed their daily routine of checking on the cattle and securing equipment for the night. The work had taken on additional significance in light of the day's confrontations, each task now representing not just operational necessity, but also defiance of those who predicted inevitable failure. Jake found satisfaction in the mundane details of ranch life, recognizing that success would ultimately be measured by their ability to maintain consistent, high-quality animal care regardless of external pressures. The dinner they shared that evening was simple but satisfying, prepared by Maria with ingredients that included vegetables from the small garden she had started behind the ranch house. Jake realized that her presence had brought changes to his daily life that extended beyond professional partnership to include domestic comforts that he hadn't experienced since his parents' deaths. The realization created feelings that he wasn't entirely sure how to process, emotions that went beyond gratitude for her professional contributions to include appreciation for her personal qualities. Their conversation over dinner revealed shared concerns about the challenges they were likely to face in coming months, but also mutual determination to prove that independent family ranching could remain viable despite pressures toward consolidation. Maria's commitment to their partnership seemed to extend beyond simple employment to include genuine investment in the ranch's success and the values it represented. Jake found himself wondering what motivated her loyalty, whether it was professional pride, personal conviction, or something more complex that he didn't yet understand. The evening concluded with both of them reviewing financial records and operational plans, working together to identify areas where improved efficiency might create additional margin for weathering whatever economic pressure Caldwell might apply. Their collaboration revealed complementary strengths, Jake's understanding of local market conditions combining with Maria's operational expertise to create strategies that neither of them could have developed alone. The partnership was evolving into something more comprehensive than simple employer-employer relationships, though neither of them had yet acknowledged the full implications of their deepening connection. As they prepared to retire for the evening, Jake felt cautiously optimistic about their ability to navigate the challenges ahead. Maria's presence had transformed his struggling operation into something that felt sustainable and hopeful, while her commitment to their shared values provided confidence that they could maintain their principles even under pressure. The confrontation with Caldwell had clarified the stakes involved in their efforts to maintain independence, but it had also revealed resources and support systems that might enable them to succeed despite superior opposition. The Silver Creek Ranch settled into nighttime quiet, but both Jake and Maria were aware that their peaceful routine was likely to be disrupted by forces beyond their control. The battle for the future of independent family ranching had been joined, and tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test their resolve, their partnership, and their commitment to values that were increasingly rare in modern agricultural operations. The discovery came 3 weeks later, hidden beneath decades of accumulated paperwork in a wooden filing cabinet Jake's grandfather had used for record keeping during the ranch's most prosperous years. Maria had volunteered to help organize the administrative chaos that had accumulated during Jake's years of focusing on operational survival rather than systematic documentation, and her methodical approach to sorting through historical records had already revealed several forgotten assets and overlooked opportunities for improving ranch efficiency. What she found buried in the bottom drawer, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string that had grown brittle with age, was a leather portfolio containing documents that Jake's grandfather had apparently considered too important to discard, but too sensitive to keep easily accessible. The portfolio held mineral rights certificates, water rights documentation, and most significantly, a geological survey from 1952 that identified potential mineral deposits throughout the Silver Creek Ranch property. The survey had been commissioned during a period when Jake's grandfather had briefly considered diversifying beyond cattle ranching, though family stories suggested that he had ultimately decided that mining would compromise the land's suitability for livestock operations. Jake studied the geological survey with growing amazement, recognizing that the document represented possibilities he had never imagined. According to the technical analysis, significant portions of the ranch sat above limestone formations that contained potential reserves of aggregate materials highly valued for construction projects. More intriguingly, the survey identified geological structures consistent with natural gas deposits, resources that could provide substantial revenue through carefully managed extraction that wouldn't interfere with surface ranching operations. The implications were staggering, both in terms of potential financial benefits and possible complications. If the geological survey was accurate, the Silver Creek Ranch possessed mineral wealth that could resolve their financial challenges permanently, while providing resources for expanding and modernizing their livestock operations. However, Jake also understood that knowledge of valuable mineral deposits would intensify Bobby Caldwell's interest in acquiring the property, potentially escalating their conflict from simple business competition to something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Maria's reaction to the discovery was characteristically practical and strategic. Rather than celebrating prematurely, she suggested that they needed professional confirmation of the survey's accuracy using modern exploration techniques that could provide definitive information about both the extent and accessibility of any mineral resources. She also pointed out that developing mineral rights would require significant capital investment and specialized expertise, resources that might necessitate partnership agreements with companies that had experience in extraction operations. The challenge of evaluating their options without alerting potential competitors led them to Carlos Mendoza, Maria's cousin who worked as a mechanic in Cedar Falls, but had previously been employed by geological survey companies throughout the western states. Carlos possessed both the technical knowledge necessary to interpret the historical survey and the discretion required to keep their investigation confidential, while they determined how best to proceed with developing newly discovered resources. Carlos arrived at the ranch on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly visiting his cousin, but actually conducting a preliminary assessment of the geological survey's credibility. His examination of the historical documents revealed that the 1952 analysis had been performed by a reputable firm, using methods that were considered reliable for that era, though modern techniques could provide much more precise information about deposit locations, extraction costs, and environmental considerations. Carlos confirmed that the geological formations described in the survey were consistent with his own observations of the ranch terrain, lending credibility to the possibility that substantial mineral resources were indeed present beneath their grazing land. The conversation that followed revealed both opportunities and complications that Jake hadn't anticipated. Carlos explained that mineral rights development required navigating complex regulatory processes that involved federal, state, and county authorities, each with different requirements and approval timelines. Additionally, any extraction operations would need to comply with environmental protection standards that had become much more stringent since the 1952 survey was completed, potentially affecting both the feasibility and profitability of accessing underground resources. More concerning was Carlos's warning about the attention that mineral rights development inevitably attracted from larger corporations with superior resources and established relationships with regulatory agencies. He had witnessed situations where small property owners found themselves overwhelmed by legal challenges, regulatory complications, and financial pressures that effectively forced them to sell their rights to better-funded competitors. The prospect of facing such challenges while simultaneously defending against Bobby Caldwell's acquisition attempts created a strategic dilemma that required careful consideration of timing, partnerships, and risk management. Jake found himself wrestling with decisions that extended far beyond the familiar challenges of ranch management. The mineral rights represented potential salvation for his family's legacy, but pursuing that opportunity would require venturing into unfamiliar territory, where his agricultural expertise provided little advantage. The learning curve involved in understanding extraction technologies, regulatory requirements, and market dynamics seemed overwhelming, especially while maintaining the daily operations that kept the ranch financially viable. Maria's perspective on their situation proved invaluable in developing a strategy that balanced opportunity with prudent risk management. She suggested that they should first obtain professional confirmation of the mineral deposit's existence and value, using that information to evaluate whether development was financially feasible given their limited resources and lack of industry experience. If the assessment proved positive, they could then explore partnership opportunities with established companies that could provide necessary expertise, while allowing them to retain ownership of the land and control over surface operations. The search for a qualified geological consultant led them to Dr. Sarah Chun, an independent geologist who specialized in mineral assessment for small property owners who couldn't afford the comprehensive services provided by major consulting firms. Dr. Chun's reputation for honest evaluation and reasonable fees had made her popular among ranchers and farmers who discovered potential mineral resources on their properties, and her willingness to maintain confidentiality was essential, given their concerns about alerting competitors to valuable discoveries. Dr. Chun's initial visit to the ranch was arranged as a routine consultation about water well placement, providing cover for her actual mission of evaluating the historical geological survey's accuracy. Her examination of the terrain, combined with analysis of the 1952 documentation, confirmed that the ranch property contained geological formations consistent with both aggregate materials and natural gas deposits. However, she cautioned that determining the actual extent and accessibility of those resources would require more sophisticated analysis using modern exploration equipment. The cost of comprehensive geological assessment proved to be substantial, representing a significant investment for a ranch operation that was already operating on extremely tight financial margins. Dr. Chin's estimate for complete mineral evaluation exceeded Jake's available resources, creating a frustrating situation where potentially valuable discoveries remained tantalizingly out of reach due to capital limitations. The irony of possessing mineral wealth that they couldn't afford to verify or develop was not lost on either Jake or Maria, though both remained determined to find a way forward that didn't compromise their independence. The solution came from an unexpected source when Father Miguel mentioned during a casual conversation that the church's building fund had accumulated surplus resources that were temporarily available for community investment opportunities. The priest explained that church leadership had been looking for ways to support local economic development while generating modest returns that could fund future expansion projects. A partnership with the Silver Creek Ranch for mineral rights assessment represented exactly the kind of community-oriented investment that aligned with their mission of supporting regional prosperity. The arrangement that emerged from discussions with church leadership was both innovative and mutually beneficial. The church would provide funding for geological assessment in exchange for a percentage of any future mineral rights revenue, with terms that protected both parties' interests while allowing the ranch to maintain ownership and operational control of the land. Father Miguel's involvement provided credibility and oversight that satisfied church concerns about investment security while giving Jake and Maria access to resources they couldn't have obtained through conventional financing. Dr. Chun's comprehensive geological survey took 2 weeks to complete, using ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, and core sampling to create detailed maps of subsurface formations throughout the ranch property. The work was conducted discreetly, with equipment positioned to appear consistent with water management or pasture improvement projects, rather than mineral exploration. Jake and Maria maintained their normal routines while the assessment proceeded, careful not to attract attention that might alert Bobby Caldwell or other potential competitors to their activities. The results exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. Dr. Chun's analysis confirmed the presence of substantial limestone deposits suitable for aggregate production, natural gas formations that could support profitable extraction operations, and previously unidentified clay deposits that had commercial value for ceramic and construction applications. Conservative estimates suggested that careful development of these resources could generate revenue streams sufficient to transform the ranch from a struggling operation into a regionally significant enterprise with multiple income sources. However, Dr. Chun's report also identified challenges that would need to be addressed before any mineral development could proceed. Environmental regulations required extensive impact assessments and mitigation planning, processes that could take months or years to complete, depending on the complexity of proposed operations. Additionally, the infrastructure necessary for extraction and transportation would require substantial capital investment, resources that exceeded what the ranch could provide independently, even with church partnership funding. The strategic implications of their discovery created both opportunities and vulnerabilities that required careful management. Knowledge of valuable mineral deposits would inevitably become public information once development activities began, attracting attention from corporations with superior resources and established industry relationships. Jake and Maria understood that they needed to establish legal protections and development partnerships before their secret became widely known, creating defensive positions that would protect their interests against more powerful competitors. The search for appropriate development partners led them to Mountain West Resources, a regional company that specialized in small-scale mineral extraction projects for independent property owners. Mountain West's business model focused on providing technical expertise and capital investment in exchange for partnership agreements that allowed original landowners to retain majority control while benefiting from professional development and marketing capabilities. Their reputation for honest dealing and environmental responsibility made them attractive partners for ranchers who wanted to develop mineral resources without compromising their agricultural operations. Negotiations with Mountain West revealed both the potential benefits and inherent complications of mineral rights development. The company's preliminary assessment confirmed Dr. Chun's findings about the ranch's mineral wealth, but their development timeline stretched across several years of regulatory approval, infrastructure construction, and market positioning before any significant revenue would be generated. The delay created strategic vulnerabilities, particularly given Bobby Caldwell's ongoing pressure to acquire the property and his likely reaction to learning about valuable mineral discoveries. Jake and Maria found themselves managing multiple complex challenges simultaneously as they worked to position themselves advantageously for mineral development, while maintaining their livestock operations and defending against acquisition attempts. The stress of juggling these competing priorities was offset by growing confidence in their partnership and increasing recognition that their collaboration was producing results that neither of them could have achieved independently. Their professional relationship was evolving into something deeper and more personal, though both remained focused on business objectives rather than acknowledging romantic feelings that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The turning point came when Bobby Caldwell made an unexpected visit to the ranch, arriving without advance notice and displaying the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he had gained significant advantage in their ongoing conflict. His demeanor suggested access to information that Jake and Maria had hoped to keep confidential, raising immediate concerns about security breaches that could compromise their strategic planning and development negotiations. Caldwell's opening Remarks confirmed their worst fears about information leakage. "Jake, I understand you've been having some interesting conversations with geological consultants lately," he said with the satisfied smile of someone holding superior cards in a high-stakes game. "I have to admire your resourcefulness in discovering those old mineral rights documents, though I'm afraid you're in over your head when it comes to developing those resources effectively. The corporate agriculture business has taught me quite a bit about mineral extraction, and I'm prepared to offer you a partnership opportunity that could benefit everyone involved." The revelation that Caldwell knew about their mineral discoveries created immediate tactical disadvantages that required careful response. Jake understood that appearing too eager to protect their secrets would confirm their value, while seeming indifferent might encourage more aggressive investigation of their activities. Maria remained silent during the initial exchange, but her alert posture suggested that she was evaluating Caldwell's knowledge and calculating potential responses to various scenarios that might develop from this confrontation. Caldwell's partnership proposal was structured to provide him with majority control over mineral development while offering Jake and Maria limited participation in potential profits. The terms were presented as generous given their relative inexperience and limited resources, but Jake recognized the arrangement as another acquisition attempt disguised as collaborative opportunity. Accepting Caldwell's offer would effectively transfer control of the ranch's most valuable assets to someone whose priorities focused on maximum extraction profits rather than balanced land use that preserved agricultural viability. The negotiation that followed tested Jake's ability to protect his interests while avoiding direct confrontation that might escalate their conflict beyond manageable levels. He acknowledged the potential value of experienced partnership while maintaining that any development agreements would need to preserve his family's ownership and operational control of the ranch property. Caldwell's response revealed frustration with continued resistance to what he clearly considered reasonable offers, suggesting that his patience with diplomatic approaches was approaching its limits. Maria's intervention in the discussion demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed both Jake and Caldwell, though for different reasons. She pointed out that mineral development required long-term planning that considered environmental sustainability, community impact, and integration with existing agricultural operations, factors that were often overlooked by companies focused primarily on extraction efficiency and short-term profitability. Her comments revealed knowledge of mineral development issues that surprised Caldwell and added credibility to their position as serious participants in development discussions rather than naive property owners who could be easily manipulated. The meeting concluded with Caldwell agreeing to provide detailed partnership proposals for their consideration, but his parting comments carried implicit threats about the consequences of continued resistance to what he characterized as mutually beneficial cooperation. Jake and Maria understood that their window of opportunity for establishing defensive positions was closing rapidly, that they needed to finalize development partnerships and legal protections before Caldwell could organize more aggressive acquisition attempts. The evening after Caldwell's visit was spent in intensive planning sessions that addressed both immediate security concerns and long-term strategic objectives. Jake and Maria worked together to identify potential information sources that might have compromised their confidentiality, reviewing everyone who had access to knowledge about their mineral discoveries and evaluating the likelihood that various individuals might have intentionally or accidentally revealed sensitive information. The exercise revealed vulnerabilities in their communication security that required immediate attention to prevent additional leakage that could further compromise their strategic position. Their discussion also addressed personal considerations that had been developing alongside their professional partnership. Both acknowledged that their working relationship had evolved beyond simple employer-employee dynamics to include mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared commitment to values that transcended business objectives. The realization that their Partnership was becoming romantic as well as professional, added emotional stakes to their struggle for ranch independence, creating additional motivation to succeed in protecting what they were building together. As they prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, Jake and Maria understood that their discovery of mineral wealth had fundamentally altered the stakes involved in their conflict with Bobby Caldwell and other forces threatening ranch independence. The next phase of their struggle would require navigating complex development partnerships, sophisticated legal strategies, and increasingly aggressive opposition from competitors with superior resources and fewer ethical constraints. However, their growing confidence in each other and their shared commitment to preserving family ranch traditions provided strength for facing whatever challenges might emerge from their decision to fight for control of their own destiny. The attack on their water supply came without warning on a Tuesday morning in late November, discovered when Maria noticed that the cattle were showing signs of dehydration, despite the automatic watering systems appearing to function normally. Her investigation revealed that someone had introduced a chemical additive to their main well that made the water unpalatable to livestock while remaining clear and odorless to human observation. The sabotage was sophisticated enough to avoid immediate detection while creating serious health risks for animals that were already stressed by early winter conditions. Jake's rage at discovering the contamination was matched by his growing understanding that Bobby Caldwell's campaign against the Silver Creek Ranch had escalated beyond business pressure to include direct attacks on their operational capabilities. The water sabotage represented a form of economic warfare that threatened not only their current livestock, but also their reputation for animal welfare that was essential to maintaining customer relationships and community support. Recovery from such an attack would require expensive well cleaning, veterinary care for affected cattle, and implementation of security measures to prevent future incidents. The response to this crisis revealed the strength of the community network that had been developing around their struggle to maintain ranch independence. Father Miguel arrived within hours of Jake's phone call, bringing with him volunteers from the church community who had experience with well maintenance and water system repair. Carlos Mendoza organized a group of mechanics and technicians who worked through the night to install filtration equipment and monitoring systems that would detect future contamination attempts. Most importantly, neighboring ranchers who had been quietly supportive of their efforts now openly provided assistance, offering temporary access to their water sources while the Silver Creek wells were being restored. The investigation into the sabotage incident was handled by Sheriff Tom Bradley, a fair-minded lawman who had been watching the escalating tension between Jake and Caldwell with growing concern about the potential for violence. Sheriff Bradley's preliminary findings suggested that the water contamination required both sophisticated chemical knowledge and detailed understanding of the ranch's infrastructure, indicating involvement by someone with resources and technical expertise that exceeded what most local individuals possessed. However, proving direct responsibility would require evidence that Caldwell had been careful not to leave, and the sheriff warned that prosecution would be difficult without witness testimony or physical proof connecting him to the sabotage. The water crisis forced Jake and Maria to accelerate their timeline for finalizing mineral development partnerships and legal protections, recognizing that Caldwell's escalating attacks indicated desperation that might lead to even more dangerous tactics. Their negotiations with Mountain West Resources took on new urgency as they worked to establish partnerships that would provide both financial resources and legal protection against acquisition attempts. The mineral wealth beneath their property represented their best hope for achieving the financial security necessary to defend against corporate pressure. But accessing those resources required surviving the immediate threats to their operational viability. Mountain West's response to the sabotage incident revealed both the opportunities and complications associated with their proposed partnership. The company's security department had experience dealing with industrial espionage and competitive interference, expertise that could help protect the ranch against future attacks. However, their involvement would also escalate the conflict by introducing corporate resources and legal capabilities that might provoke even more aggressive responses from Caldwell and his allies. Jake and Maria found themselves weighing the benefits of professional protection against the risks of expanding their struggle into a full-scale corporate war. The decision to proceed with Mountain West Partnership was made easier by intelligence that Carlos Mendoza had gathered about Caldwell's connections to larger corporate agriculture networks. Through his contacts in the regional business community, Carlos had learned that Caldwell's interest in the Silver Creek Ranch was part of a broader consolidation strategy involving several major companies that wanted to control mineral rights throughout the valley. The revelation that they were facing not just one wealthy neighbor, but an entire network of corporate interests, made it clear that independent resistance would be insufficient to protect their property and way of life. The formal partnership agreement with Mountain West was signed in the law offices of Helena Morrison, an attorney who specialized in mineral rights and agricultural law. Morrison's reputation for protecting small property owners against corporate acquisition attempts had made her popular among ranchers facing pressure from larger competitors, and her involvement provided credibility that would be important in regulatory proceedings and potential legal challenges. The partnership terms gave Jake and Maria majority control over surface operations while providing Mountain West with development rights that could generate substantial revenue for all parties involved. However, the celebration of achieving legal protection was short-lived, interrupted by news that Caldwell had filed environmental challenges to their mineral development plans with both state and federal regulatory agencies. The legal actions were clearly intended to delay development long enough for alternative acquisition strategies to succeed, but they also demonstrated Caldwell's access to sophisticated legal resources and regulatory knowledge that could make their situation much more complicated. Morrison warned that defending against regulatory challenges would require substantial legal expenses and could delay revenue generation by months or years, depending on the complexity of issues raised. The environmental challenges created new pressures that tested Jake and Maria's relationship as they struggled to balance optimism about mineral wealth with realism about the obstacles preventing them from accessing those resources. The stress of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously while maintaining daily ranch operations created tensions that neither of them had anticipated, forcing them to address personal dynamics that had been developing alongside their professional partnership. Their growing romantic attachment provided emotional support during challenging times, but it also created additional stakes that made failure feel more devastating than simple business losses. The breakthrough in their defensive strategy came from an unexpected source when Dr. Sarah Chun contacted them with information about federal programs that provided protection for small-scale mineral development projects that demonstrated environmental responsibility and community benefit. The programs were designed to prevent large corporations from using regulatory challenges to eliminate competition from independent operators, and they offered both financial assistance and legal support for projects that met specific criteria regarding sustainability and local economic impact. Chun's expertise in environmental compliance had identified opportunities that neither Jake nor their attorney had known existed. The application process for federal protection required extensive documentation of their environmental safeguards, community partnerships, and long-term development plans, work that consumed weeks of intensive preparation while they continued managing daily ranch operations and defending against ongoing pressure from Caldwell's various initiatives. Maria's organizational skills proved invaluable in coordinating the complex requirements, her attention to detail ensuring that their application would meet all technical specifications while presenting their project in terms that emphasized positive community impact rather than simply commercial opportunity. The federal review process also required public hearings where community members could express support or opposition to proposed mineral development, creating opportunities for both advocacy and confrontation that would determine the ultimate success of their defensive strategy. Jake and Maria spent considerable time building community support for their project, explaining how mineral development revenue would benefit local suppliers, contractors, and service providers while maintaining agricultural operations that preserved rural character and environmental quality. Their presentations emphasized the contrast between their approach and typical corporate development that prioritized extraction efficiency over community integration. Bobby Caldwell's response to their federal application was swift and aggressive, involving the mobilization of opposition groups, regulatory challenges, and media campaigns designed to present their mineral development project as environmentally dangerous and economically irresponsible. His attacks focused on the inexperience of ranch management, the potential for environmental damage from small-scale operations, and the precedent that successful mineral development might create for other independent projects that could compete with corporate agriculture initiatives. The sophistication of his opposition strategy demonstrated access to professional public relations and legal resources that exceeded what most regional business disputes typically involved. The public hearing held in Cedar Falls became a community referendum on the broader question of whether independent family operations could survive in an economic environment increasingly dominated by corporate consolidation. Supporters of the Silver Creek Ranch project emphasized the importance of maintaining local control over natural resources while providing opportunities for regional economic development that benefited existing residents rather than outside investors. Opposition speakers focused on environmental concerns and regulatory compliance issues, though their arguments often seemed more focused on preventing competition and protecting natural resources. Maria's testimony at the public hearing proved to be a pivotal moment in building community support for their project. Her presentation combined technical expertise about environmental safeguards with personal insights about the importance of preserving opportunities for independent agricultural operations in rural communities. She spoke about the integration of mineral development with sustainable ranching practices, emphasizing how careful resource management could generate economic benefits while maintaining the rural character that made the valley attractive to both residents and visitors. Her bilingual presentation also addressed concerns from Hispanic community members who had been targeted by opposition campaigns suggesting that mineral development would create environmental hazards in areas where their families lived and worked. Jake's contribution to the hearing focused on the historical significance of family ranching in regional development and the economic benefits that mineral revenue could provide for supporting agricultural operations that might otherwise be forced to sell to corporate buyers. He emphasized the contrast between their approach, which prioritized long-term sustainability and community integration, and corporate development strategies that typically focused on maximum extraction with minimal regard for local impact. His presentation also addressed the broader implications of allowing economic pressure to eliminate independent operations, arguing that community diversity and resilience required supporting various approaches to land use and economic development. The federal decision to approve their mineral development project came with conditions that required extensive environmental monitoring, community oversight, and revenue sharing that would benefit regional development initiatives. The approval provided legal protection against regulatory challenges, while establishing frameworks for responsible development that addressed legitimate environmental concerns. However, the conditions also created additional compliance costs and operational restrictions that would affect both the timeline and profitability of their mineral extraction activities. Caldwell's reaction to their federal approval was predictably aggressive, involving the initiation of legal appeals, media campaigns questioning the federal decision-making process, and escalated pressure tactics directed at community members who had supported the Silver Creek Ranch project. His response demonstrated that approval of their mineral development had not resolved their conflict but had instead escalated it to a new level that would require different defensive strategies and potentially greater personal risks for everyone involved in supporting ranch independence. The celebration of their federal approval was tempered by recognition that achieving legal permission for mineral development was only the first step in a longer process that would test their resolve, their partnership, and their commitment to maintaining independence in the face of increasingly sophisticated opposition. Jake and Maria found themselves preparing for conflicts that would extend far beyond traditional business competition to include legal battles, media warfare, and community organizing that would determine whether independent family operations could survive in an economic environment designed to favor large corporations with superior resources. The evening after receiving federal approval, Jake and Maria walked together across property that now represented not just their family legacy but also their shared future and their contribution to broader struggles for economic justice and community self-determination. Their relationship had evolved through months of crisis management and strategic planning to include deep personal connection and mutual commitment that transcended professional partnership. The realization that they were building something together that was both personally meaningful and economically significant provided motivation for facing whatever challenges Caldwell's escalating opposition might create. The development timeline for their mineral extraction project stretched across 18 months of infrastructure construction, equipment installation, and operational startup, providing Caldwell with extended opportunities to interfere with their progress through legal challenges, regulatory complaints, and economic pressure directed at their contractors and suppliers. Jake and Maria understood that maintaining momentum during this vulnerable period would require constant vigilance and strategic flexibility to respond to opposition tactics that would likely become increasingly desperate as their project approached operational status. The support network that had developed around their struggle expanded to include environmental groups interested in their sustainable development model, agricultural organizations concerned about corporate consolidation trends, and community development advocates who viewed their project as demonstrating possibilities for local control over natural resources. These alliances provided both practical assistance and political protection that would be important in defending against opposition campaigns, but they also created expectations and obligations that added complexity to their decision-making processes. As winter settled over Sunset Valley, Jake and Maria found themselves managing multiple complex initiatives simultaneously while maintaining the daily operations that sustained both their livestock and their relationship. The cattle had recovered from the water contamination incident. Their mineral development project had achieved federal approval, and their partnership had evolved into love that strengthened their resolve to protect what they were building together. However, they also understood that Bobby Caldwell's opposition would likely intensify as their project moved closer to generating revenue and establishing precedents that could threaten his broader consolidation strategy. The stage was set for confrontations that would determine not only the future of the Silver Creek Ranch, but also the broader question of whether independent family operations could maintain viability in an economic system increasingly dominated by corporate agriculture. Jake and Maria had achieved significant victories in their struggle for independence, but the most challenging battles lay ahead as they prepared to defend their hard-won gains against opponents with superior resources and fewer ethical constraints. About the methods they were willing to employ. The final confrontation came on a bitter February morning when Bobby Caldwell arrived at the Silver Creek Ranch with a convoy of vehicles that included his attorney, a team of corporate representatives, and what appeared to be private security personnel. The intimidating display of force was clearly intended to pressure Jake and Maria into accepting what Caldwell characterized as his final offer for acquiring the property, though the terms he presented were barely disguised ultimatums that would strip them of both ownership and operational control, while providing minimal compensation for their mineral rights and agricultural assets. Jake met the delegation at the ranch gate, his calm demeanor masking the anger he felt at this blatant attempt to use intimidation tactics instead of legitimate business negotiation. Maria stood beside him, her presence providing both moral support and practical reinforcement that they would face this challenge together, as they had confronted every previous crisis in their partnership. The assembled corporate professionals represented everything they had been fighting against: the concentration of power in fewer hands, the reduction of agriculture to pure profit calculations, and the elimination of family operations that prioritize community values over maximum financial returns. Caldwell's opening presentation was delivered with the practiced confidence of someone who had successfully acquired dozens of properties through similar pressure campaigns. He outlined the financial difficulties that independent ranchers faced in current economic conditions, the regulatory challenges that would complicate their mineral development project, and the isolation they would experience as community members were forced to choose between supporting local businesses or maintaining relationships with more powerful regional economic interests. His message was clear: resistance was futile, and continued opposition would only increase the eventual cost of inevitable surrender. The corporate attorney accompanying Caldwell presented documentation that revealed the extent of legal and financial resources they were prepared to deploy in pursuit of property acquisition. The materials included environmental challenges that could delay mineral development for years, regulatory complaints that could create costly compliance requirements, and civil litigation that could drain their resources through legal fees regardless of ultimate outcomes. The presentation was designed to demonstrate that they possessed superior firepower in any extended conflict while offering terms that would allow Jake and Maria to exit with dignity and modest compensation. Jake's response surprised the corporate delegation with its informed confidence and strategic sophistication that contradicted their assumptions about unsophisticated rural operators who could be overwhelmed by superior legal and financial resources. His presentation outlined federal protections that applied to their mineral development project, community support networks that provided both practical assistance and political influence, and partnership agreements with Mountain West Resources that created defensive capabilities exceeding what typical family ranches could maintain independently. He made it clear that their operation was no longer the vulnerable target that Caldwell had originally identified for acquisition. Maria's contribution to the confrontation demonstrated knowledge of agricultural law, environmental regulations, and community organizing that impressed even the corporate professionals, who had arrived expecting to negotiate with inexperienced ranch owners. She presented documentation of their environmental compliance, community economic impact, and sustainable development practices that addressed every concern raised in Caldwell's regulatory challenges. Her presentation also included testimonials from community leaders, environmental groups, and agricultural organizations that supported their project and opposed corporate consolidation trends that threatened regional economic diversity. The negotiation that followed revealed fundamental differences in values and priorities that made compromise impossible, despite economic incentives that both sides could have found acceptable under different circumstances. Caldwell's team focused exclusively on financial considerations, viewing the ranch property as an investment opportunity that should be developed for maximum profitability, regardless of community impact or environmental consequences. Jake and Maria emphasized stewardship responsibilities, community integration, and sustainable practices that preserved both economic viability and rural character for future generations. The breaking point came when Caldwell's attorney implied that continued resistance would result in investigations of Maria's immigration status and employment authorization, a threat that revealed both the desperation of their position and their willingness to use personal attacks when business pressure failed to achieve desired results. The suggestion that they would target Maria's legal status and family connections demonstrated exactly the kind of ruthless tactics that had enabled corporate consolidation throughout the agricultural sector, but it also galvanized community opposition that had been building throughout their extended conflict. Jake's response to the immigration threat was immediate and decisive, making it clear that any attempt to harass Maria or her family would result in federal civil rights complaints, media exposure of discriminatory practices, and mobilization of community resources to protect families who were being targeted for supporting independent agricultural operations. His defense of Maria demonstrated both personal commitment and strategic understanding that their struggle represented broader issues of economic justice and community self-determination that extended far beyond individual property disputes. The arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley interrupted the increasingly hostile confrontation, though his presence had been requested by community members who were concerned about escalating tensions and potential violence. Sheriff Bradley's assessment of the situation was characteristically direct. He made it clear that intimidation tactics and implied threats would not be tolerated regardless of the economic resources available to various parties involved in the dispute. His intervention provided cooling-off period that allowed both sides to step back from confrontation that was approaching dangerous levels. Father Miguel's appearance at the ranch during the corporate delegation's visit was not coincidental, as community leaders had organized informal monitoring of the situation to ensure that intimidation tactics did not escalate into violence or illegal harassment. The priest's presence represented moral authority and community solidarity that contradicted Caldwell's assumptions about regional support for corporate consolidation. His quiet dignity and obvious respect within the community provided additional evidence that Jake and Maria's struggle had broader support than their opponents had recognized. The corporate delegation's departure was accompanied by promises of continued legal and regulatory pressure, but their threats lacked the confidence that had characterized their arrival. The confrontation had revealed that the Silver Creek Ranch was no longer the isolated target they had expected to acquire through superior resources and political connections. Instead, they faced an integrated defensive network that included federal protections, corporate partnerships, community support, and legal expertise that could match their own capabilities while maintaining superior moral authority and public sympathy. The weeks following the confrontation brought accelerated progress on mineral development. Infrastructure as Mountain West Resources mobilized additional resources to ensure that the project achieved operational status before additional interference could be organized. The company's security department also implemented protective measures that included surveillance systems, communication monitoring, and rapid response capabilities designed to prevent sabotage attempts or other tactics that might disrupt construction activities. Their corporate experience with industrial espionage and competitive interference provided protective capabilities that supplemented community support and law enforcement oversight. Jake and Maria found their relationship deepening during this period of intensive activity and external pressure. Their shared commitment to defending ranch independence, creating emotional bonds that transcended professional partnership. The realization that they were fighting not just for property ownership, but for their future together, added personal stakes that strengthened their resolve while creating additional motivation to succeed despite superior opposition. Their love story was inseparable from their struggle for economic justice and community self-determination. The first successful mineral extraction from the Silver Creek Ranch occurred in early April, generating revenue that immediately transformed their financial situation while validating their decision to resist corporate acquisition pressure. The sustainable development model they had implemented attracted attention from environmental groups, community development organizations, and other independent operators who were interested in replicating their success in defending against corporate consolidation. Their project became a regional symbol of possibilities for maintaining local control over natural resources while generating economic benefits for existing communities. Bobby Caldwell's response to their operational success was a final legal challenge that attempted to invalidate their federal approvals based on alleged procedural irregularities and environmental compliance failures. However, the comprehensive documentation that Maria had maintained throughout their approval process provided complete defense against accusations that might have succeeded against less carefully managed projects. The legal challenge was dismissed, with sanctions against frivolous litigation, effectively ending Caldwell's campaign while establishing precedents that would protect other independent operations against similar pressure tactics. The victory celebration organized by the Cedar Falls community demonstrated the extent of support that had developed around their struggle, bringing together ranchers, agricultural workers, environmental advocates, and community leaders who viewed their success as validation of possibilities for economic development that benefited existing residents rather than outside investors. The celebration also served as Jake and Maria's engagement announcement, formalizing personal commitments that had been developing alongside their professional partnership throughout months of crisis management and strategic planning. Their wedding, performed by Father Miguel in the Sacred Heart Catholic Church, symbolized not only personal happiness but also community triumph over corporate pressure and cultural integration that transcended traditional divisions between Anglo and Hispanic populations. The ceremony brought together supporters from throughout the region who had contributed to their success through practical assistance, political support, and moral encouragement during challenging times. The celebration continued at the Silver Creek Ranch, where guests could observe firsthand the successful integration of mineral development with sustainable ranching that had become a model for independent operations throughout the Mountain West. The economic success of their mineral development project enabled expansion and modernization of their ranching operations while maintaining environmental standards and community relationships that had been essential to their survival during corporate acquisition pressure. Revenue from extraction activities supported investment in improved cattle facilities, pasture management systems, and equipment that increased both efficiency and animal welfare standards. Their operation became a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture practices that attracted visitors from other regions facing similar consolidation pressures. Maria's role as ranch manager evolved to include regional leadership in agricultural organizations and community development initiatives that promoted independent family operations and sustainable resource management. Her bilingual capabilities and cultural connections helped bridge divisions between Anglo and Hispanic communities, while her technical expertise contributed to policy discussions about agricultural sustainability and rural economic development. Her success challenged traditional assumptions about gender roles in ranch management while demonstrating possibilities for leadership that combined practical skills with strategic vision. Jake's transformation from struggling ranch owner to successful entrepreneur and community leader reflected both personal growth and changing economic realities that created opportunities for those willing to innovate while maintaining commitment to traditional values. His willingness to challenge corporate consolidation while building partnerships that provided mutual benefits demonstrated leadership qualities that earned respect throughout the agricultural community. His success inspired other family operations to resist acquisition pressure while seeking alternative strategies for achieving financial sustainability. The Silver Creek Ranch became a regional center for training and technical assistance that helped other family operations develop mineral resources, implement sustainable practices, and organize community support networks that could resist corporate pressure tactics. Jake and Maria's experience provided practical knowledge about navigating regulatory processes, building defensive partnerships, and maintaining operational viability during extended conflicts with better-funded opponents. Their success stories encouraged others to believe that independent operations could survive and prosper, despite economic trends that favored consolidation. 5 years after Bobby Caldwell's final acquisition attempt, the Silver Creek Ranch had become one of the most successful integrated agricultural and mineral operations in the Mountain West, generating revenue that supported both family prosperity and community development initiatives throughout Sunset Valley. Their sustainable development model had been replicated by dozens of other operations, creating a regional network of independent producers who shared resources, expertise, and political influence that protected them against future corporate consolidation pressure. The legacy of their struggle extended beyond individual success to include broader changes in regional attitudes about agricultural development, community self-determination, and the importance of maintaining economic diversity that supported rural communities rather than extracting wealth for outside investors. Their story became inspiration for people throughout rural America who faced similar pressures from corporate consolidation while seeking ways to preserve family operations and community values that had sustained rural life for generations. As Jake and Maria watched their children play in the yard where they had first met during her job interview, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate struggle for survival to prosperous partnership that combined personal happiness with community leadership. Their love story was inseparable from their fight for economic justice, and their success demonstrated that individual courage and community solidarity could triumph over corporate power when people were willing to work together for shared values and mutual benefit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.